have shown that they are not just some tinderbox, right, waiting to be set alight by religious controversy, right? Just because there is a provocation. So we saw images of attacks on schools and consulates and embassies, etc. But all of that tragic violence took place outside of Europe. And I would argue that part of that has to do with this new institutionalization and this new symbolic politics. Right? If you compare even just the mobilization around the Danish cartoon crisis to the mobilization around the Rushdie affair, right, when the Satanic Verses was published in 88, 89, and the kind of rhetoric and the kind of mobilization and the kind of protests coming out of Muslim groups then who were completely outside of the system and who had very little incentive to, quote unquote, behave politically because they were not part of any discussion, and compare it to, just 15, 20 years later, whether in 06, 07, or now in 2011, 2012, last year, you see a huge, huge difference in the kind of concerns and the kind of rhetoric coming out of the same organizations sometimes. So in Europe, in the fall, the angry response to this YouTube video took the place just of some street demonstrations, right? There was a protest in Dublin of some hundreds of Muslims who marched on the headquarters of Google. There were demonstrations in Paris, there was a demonstration in Antwerp. This led to some arrests, but there was no violence. There were protests in some German cities as well. There were organizations across Europe that actually began to file lawsuits in the same way they did against the Charlie Hebdo when it published its incendiary issue, which was sort of mocking the prophet. And most of these organizations who are engaged in some kind of dialogue with the state all urge their constituents to avoid the trap of provocation. Right? And I would argue that this is exactly the kind of sort of political response that we see once institutions are sort of starting to take effect. So we see the lawsuits against Charlie Hebdo, we see the lawsuits against El Jueves in Spain for blasphemy, for inciting hatred, just like we saw lawsuits against Oriana Fallaci when she published her tirade in Italy, or against there was a French author named Michel Houellebecq who also had made some insulting comments. And you see an increasingly quote-unquote responsible response to these acts of provocation, which is to say that Muslims are using their rights as citizens to protect themselves legally, right? They file injunctions to have a newspaper blocked, or they file a lawsuit for an incitement to racial hatred. Now you could say, well, I don't agree with that, right? I think that they should be thicker skinned. I think that they should be able to take the criticism. I think that they should, but that's not the point, right? The point isn't whether or not one agrees with the sentiment being expressed or the reaction to the sentiment. It's just enough to see that this is now fitting a pattern that other groups also use to defend themselves in the political arena, right? So it's tempting, I think, to think that very little has changed in some ways since the Satanic Verses was published more than almost 25 years ago. But we have to remember that other groups have also been sensitive at times and have behaved also, quote unquote, in an overreactive way. There was, in the late 1980s, just actually the same month as the Satanic Verses was published, there were two films released in France that absolutely infuriated religious fundamentalists. So this was the fall of 1988. One film was Claude Chabrol, Une affaire de femme, which was a representation of prostitution and abortion in wartime France. And the other film you'll probably remember was Martin Scorsese's Last Temptation of Christ. Now, there was immense religious backlash to these two films in France. That fall, right, so this is before the Rush Day Fair, but only just. That fall, there was a gas bomb attack on a Paris theater that was showing this film by Claude Chabrol, and it killed a moviegoer in October of 1988. When The Last Temptation of Christ premiered in Paris, demonstrators threw tear gas, broke theater windows, and attacked members of the audiences. Right? You can read all of this in Le Monde from that month. There were several other French cinemas that were destroyed by fire. One case, 14 people were hospitalized. The film was actually withdrawn from all French theaters, except for one that stayed open with police protection. So in other words, we see a tiny minority of religious fundamentalists, in this case Catholic religious fundamentalists, intolerant fanatics, whatever you want to call them. They achieved their goal, effectively, of censorship. Now, that is not a common approach, right? It's helpful to remember that this took place. I certainly forgot or never knew before I looked into it. But that's not the usual form of self-defense mobilization for religious groups in Europe. A much more common approach is, of course, through lawful behavior and or acts of civil disobedience, right? So that might be to block caricatures or artwork that is thought to be discriminatory or hateful. So we can look to alternative efforts, in some cases by the same group. So when The Last Temptation of Christ was being advertised in the London Underground, there was a Catholic group that objected and managed to actually have the posters withdrawn, but using, legal arguments, bureaucratic means to do so. There was an anti-Semitic play in Frankfurt around the same time, put together by the German director Fassbinder. This play wound up being the stage was occupied by Jewish community leaders at the time, and the play wound up being canceled. In 2002, there was a cartoon in La Stampa, in the Italian paper from Turin, showing a picture of, it was during a siege of Bethlehem. There was some conflict between the Israeli army and I don't remember whom. But there was a cartoon in the newspaper that essentially wound up playing on anti-Semitic themes and making a sort of joke about, they killed baby Jesus and now they want to kill him again. And so this cartoonist was actually fired from the newspaper. There was an ad for Girbaud's jeans in 2005, okay, that was inspired by Da Vinci's Last Supper. I don't know if any of you remember this, but there were essentially 11 or 13 sort of attractive models who were all sitting around a table as if it were the Last Supper. They were all dressed, but they were, I guess, dressed in not very religious fashion. And this wound up also being censored, actually, from the French media. So anyway, my point here is not to kind of search for equivalencies or to celebrate religious sensitivity. Again, it's beside the point. And I think that the standards of blasphemy will also continue to evolve as they have for these other communities. They will continue to evolve for Muslim communities in the West. But just to remind ourselves that our reaction to violent extremism should be proportionate to the numbers of violent extremists, right? And to remember the weaknesses that a lot of communities have had to get their minds around in order to have a semblance of internal control. So these lawsuits filed against authors and magazines, again, whatever you think of them, they simply illustrate the formal power of emancipation, right? Institutional access, legal protection. And so by registering offense, even if it's, because you're too sensitive, you're registering your offense and you're protesting discrimination because you're employing your democratic rights. We see many different examples of this in the lead up to the vote, for example, in North Rhine-Westphalia. Last year, you may recall on the news there were these images of violent Salafist youngsters who had sort of taken the streets and who got into a street fight with the police there, actually wound up injuring 30 German police. It was a very bad scene. They were shouting, you know, God is great. They really looked the part, right? They were sort of the worst nightmare of these sort of staid European societies who are skeptical of Muslim integration, and they see these 200 guys who are beating up cops, and they think, okay, great, this is really, you know, the worst possible thing. And that indeed set back the image of German Muslims, I think, really by a lot. But something much more important and something much more interesting took place around the same time, which was that the federations of Muslim groups in that same land called for the expression of their opinions and rights in the ballot box. Right? They said, what you need to do as German Muslims, and there are more than 1 million of them in this state of North Rhine-Westphalia, what you need to do is your Islamic duty to go vote. Right? They didn't even say whom to vote for. They just said, go vote. Right? And that's obviously a much more powerful and much more interesting indicator of integration. And it's also something that obviously did not get much attention. I see that I'm about up with time, so let me stop there, and I can, what would you like? Should I keep going?
The problem is I don't know.
Okay.
If there is it was or not. I think
Okay.
it's more.
Yeah, we can continue tomorrow.
Because if you are closing and we have to sleep here, maybe not the right place. Okay?
Yeah.
So, thank you very much. There will be no questions.